Welcome back to Inclusive Design 24 for 2024, brought to you in partnership with our Platinum supporters, Barrier Break and Intopia, and our Gold supporters, InfoAxia and Tetralogical. You can follow us on Mastodon, Blue Sky, LinkedIn, and Twitter. And if you have questions for the presenters, post them using the ID24 hashtag. Or you can use the YouTube chat. We'll gather your questions for our Q&A at the end of the session. A reminder that ID24 is a respectful community, and you can find our code of conduct on the Inclusive Design 24 website. I'm delighted to be joined by my guest host, David Swallow. David, I'm going to hand over to you.
Okay, thanks, Stuart. So next up, we have got Ross Mullen, Director of CANAXESS, who will be looking at how to integrate accessibility into agile practices and specifically mastering accessibility acceptance criteria for better user stories. Over to you, Ross.
Thanks, folks. Documenting accessibility requirements for user stories is hard. When trying to describe which accessibility behavior to build into the early requirements, it either becomes meticulously documenting all the relevant WCAG criteria for the feature or mentioning refer to WCAG and hope the accessibility gods look favorably on the developer crafting the feature. On screen is a slide showing several people all looking uncertain. The people creating the user stories are business analysts who are confident translating business requirements into work tasks, but understandably have limited knowledge of WCAG and accessibility. They know it's important, but translating that importance into actionable, detailed criteria which a new feature must demonstrate is unfair. It's unfair to put so much emphasis on BAs to ensure the right accessibility criteria are highlighted when, of course, they're not experts in a WCAG or accessibility. The people with this expert knowledge are accessibility specialists, but these individuals are also so few in number in large organizations that it's impractical for every user story to have an accessibility specialist oversight and tick of approval of what criteria to include. The accessibility specialists tend to be a small team supporting many other teams, all doing a range of features with numerous user stories simultaneously. Now, this model of operating works well with two teams as it's usually quite manageable to provide to constant focused accessibility advice. But with another team, it becomes a little bit more challenging, and adding a fourth and fifth team to the mix, well, let's be honest, it won't lead to a great outcome. Teams are trying to create numerous bits of functionality with increasingly limited resources, and the delivery of new features isn't going to slow down anytime soon whilst they wait for this detailed advice to be provided. Now, the accessibility team's ability to provide timely and knowledgeable advice is impacted. As teams grow ever larger, it becomes increasingly difficult to detail good accessibility practice. And our collective best accessibility documentation efforts begin to break down into copy and paste from previous user stories, and a lot of holding our heads in our hands when a feature is inevitably created with less than stellar accessibility. What if there was another way that balanced the needs to document accessibility, but not be so onerous for the BAs creating the user stories? Well, there is. Over several months, we created accessibility acceptance criteria with a local supermarket, and they've been used incredibly effectively for all user story development. These accessibility acceptance criteria are applied when user stories are created. And we also flipped the perspective on how to provide detailed accessibility advice. Instead of being developer-focused, describing in intricate detail which WCAG guidelines to include, they're BA-focused. And describe key behaviours the finished feature needs to display. But the criteria don't specify how to do it. They describe an outcome which the feature must demonstrate. They define the boundaries of a user story and what to focus on for the developer, and are used to confirm when a story is complete and ready to be developed. They're written in simple language, and because of this, they're more easily understood by all members of a team who have a different expertise and varying levels of fluency in each other's role. The intention was accessibility criteria for a developer could be created by a BA. In theory, this all sounded wonderful. A new way to document accessibility without having to wade through WCAG. But there are still 50 plus WCAG success criteria to document in some capacity. How to condense all of that? We didn't just want to replicate WCAG in another format, so our starting point was to identify and group common accessibility failings. These were issues which appeared again and again from our testing and internal accessibility reports. We added broad criteria like a keyboard inaccessible for content, unclear focus effects, and form control labeling. This gave us 20 acceptance criteria, which is still quite a lot. And this was whittled down further to 10. We settled on 10 because if there's less than 10 criteria, we're probably missing out key accessibility requirements, whereas greater than 10, it becomes a burden for the BA to apply. A 10 seemed to be that sweet spot, that nice point. These 10 issues were common failing, high impact criteria, which align to one or more WCAG success criteria. They are 1, keyboard accessibility, 2, content on hover, 3, page title, 4, visible focus, 5, semantic markup used appropriately, 6, form control labeling and inline errors, 7, screen reader, 8, zoom and resize, 9, alt text, and lastly 10, orientation and reflow. Each criteria uses the behavior-driven development format, describing how the desired behavior is described. The BDD format puts the user at the center of the story development, describing a type of user, something they're doing, and the expected output. And it helps reduce the documenting of requirements to build gap between the business analyst and other technical users like developers. The format usually has 2 sections. The first part is the narrative. This is where the purpose and the value of the feature are explained, and then user acceptance criteria. This is where the scenarios of a feature are explained. For example, given I'm a type of user, when I encounter the type of content being created, then I can the expected outcome. The main advantage of using the BDD approach for user story development and writing is that it improves team collaboration. The user story explains the requirement in non-technical language when delivering the feature. Because it uses simple language, the developer can understand it, as well as the BA, a tester, and product owner. The development team can refer to it to understand the requirements in an easy to understand way, helping to reduce assumptions and the often back and forth communication between them and an already overstretched accessibility team. Therefore, applying this format to accessibility acceptance criterion number 1, keyboard accessibility, gives: given I am a keyboard user, when I encounter interactive content, then I can control it solely from the keyboard. This identifies a keyboard user and a type of the content which the user interacts with. So things like buttons and links. And the outcome for those is that they must be controllable from a keyboard. This maps directly to WCAG Success Criterion 2.1.1 keyboard and is easier to digest and understand. Make interactive for content usable from the keyboard is a lot easier to understand than simply providing the link to the success criterion. But a lot of the detail in this success criterion, including specific timings for individual keystrokes and exceptions, has been left out, as we wanted something that was simple to understand and apply. If more detail is added, it potentially slows down the delivery time frame, with teams having to understand and unpick the detail. And we didn't want to try and boil the ocean and document every possible situation for keyboard use. It's balancing to provide broad guidance with just enough detail. If we attempted to document all the detail in 2.1.1, then really we've not improved things. We would have simply duplicated the WCAG. We didn't want to place the burden of having to decode the WCAG on the shoulders of the BAs or developers when they don't really know it. This approach we found is easy to understand, digest, and apply. The accessibility acceptance criteria combine a detail which is both global accessibility issues and localized accessibility issues. AAC3, AAC4, and AAC5 describe an outcome which probably wouldn't be relevant for many user stories. Accessibility acceptance criterion number 3, page title, ensures a page is titled appropriately and is understandable. Accessibility acceptance criterion number 4, visible focus, ensures a keyboard user's focus is always visible wherever they are on the page. And accessibility acceptance criterion number 5, semantic markup is used appropriately, ensures lists of items, headings, and tables all use the correct semantic HTML elements to describe meaning. It's unlikely these accessibility acceptance criteria would be applied for every user story, as the features they're describing are more global in nature. I mentioned earlier that 10 accessibility acceptance criteria were created, but taking into account the global nature of 2, possibly 3 criteria and how they probably won't be referenced regularly means it's 7 issues to be applied. This is quite a reasonable expectation for business analysts to understand and begin applying. If we look at accessibility acceptance criterion number 6, form control labeling and inline errors, it describes the requirement for labeling form controls and inline errors appropriately. Instead of multiple acceptance criteria for different parts of the form, this combines several success criteria into one statement. Given I use a screen reader, when I focus on form controls, then I can understand what type of data is required. This maps to success criterion 1.3.1, info and relationships for accessible form labeling, and 3.3.1, error identification. This is also centered on a screen reader user. So if a form feature is being created and the screen reader can output form labels and error messages, there is a greater likelihood that it's built correctly for other assistive technologies to understand. We assume that providing a screen reader specific user story will also mean we've supported other assistive technologies. There is an expectation as well that as our development teams were building out a feature, they're performing rudimentary screen reader for testing. It doesn't stop them from coding in incorrect behavior, but if they're able to achieve the output determined by the accessibility acceptance criteria, then we know we're developing form labeling and error messages correctly. Accessibility acceptance criterion number 7, screen reader, describes the requirement that any client-side screen updates are output by the screen reader. The technology the organization's web app was being created in was a single-page application. We knew previously these sorts of applications had problematic issues when the content is updated on the client side without a hard refresh. So we wanted to create a requirement that captures everything which updates once the page has loaded, since these are often pain points where the change is only provided visually. Trying to capture all the complexity and nuance resulted in this requirement to be announced by the screen reader. Using the same format for this criterion given I use a screen reader, when visual change occurs on the page, then I can understand the change audibly. For example, search results are displaying whilst searching, errors displaying after activating a submit button. This identifies a screen reader user, the situation being encountered, which is when something changes visually, and the outcome from that change should be output by the screen reader. This maps to 4.1.2 name, role, and value. It's basically a shorthand way for trying to distill all the technical detail in the WCAG criterion into something easy to understand. Accessibility acceptance criteria number 9, alt text, describes the requirement that any descriptive images be understood non-visually. Using the familiar format for this criterion gives, given I use a screen reader, when I encounter a descriptive image, then I can understand the image non-visually. This describes a screen reader user, the situation which is encountered, a descriptive image, and the outcome should be descriptive images can be understood because the text alternative has been provided. This criterion maps to 1.1.1 non-text content. It's prefaced itself with alt text as the technique to apply, but really there is scope for any text alternative for descriptive images. We found through most of our reports, most of the time, it's just by providing alt text, but equally other methods which can do the same thing are included, although they're not explicitly mentioned. Whilst we were incredibly pleased with these outcomes, I still had a difficulty with this list of 10 items. There was a sense of, they seem pretty basic. Is there more to it? Should there be more to it? I've read lots of articles where people have baked in accessibility requirements early and everything becomes a well-oiled machine. But what the articles often leave out is the development teams are small and the accessibility team is tightly integrated into the delivery process, and it makes it far, far easier to collaborate. When there are several teams, each creating features simultaneously, this utopian model of documenting and building in accessibility and close collaboration becomes increasingly difficult. We're always looking for a silver bullet that addresses all the accessibility challenges to building an accessible web. Every approach has at least one downside when put into action, and perhaps the biggest challenge that comes with this technique is the absence of WCAG criteria in detail. On screen shows two developers approaching the coding of acceptance criterion 6, form control labeling and inline errors differently. One, a developer codes the feature with a label element, programmatically connecting it to the form control named name, whilst the other developer uses the ARIA label attribute with a value of name. The acceptance criteria do not discuss how the feature needs to be built. They're only focused on the outcome. A developer developing a user story may not fully understand how to proceed with the implementation without having the technical detail in place. Or multiple developers approach the accessibility requirements in widely different ways. As long as the end result is met, is this a problem if two developers approach it differently? This technical information we found still needs to be given to the developers via a different mechanism. But we found accessibility acceptance criteria are a way to triage the documentation of accessibility information and keep it in focus and make it tangible to help teams document what accessibility behavior is required, rather than a hand-wavy approach of make it accessible. The accessibility acceptance criteria aren't perfect. There are gaps and they don't replace the accessibility support provided by a dedicated team, but they do complement the training we were already providing to the BAs and developers. Taking lessons from the computer security industry, this is defense in depth. It's ensuring the often quoted advice of bake-in accessibility or shifting left means every member of a team is doing a little bit with accessibility. Even though accessibility is reliant on good accessible code, it's no longer a developer-centric task only. The criteria encourage progress over perfection. We needed some mechanism to capture early requirements at the user story stage, which would take the pressure off the small team and empower development teams to self-serve themselves more effectively. In essence, less accessibility, hand-holding, and more self-serving. But let's try it out with a hypothetical new feature to be developed, a dialogue. The business analysts understand that the dialogues need to be built in the correct way, be navigable from the keyboard and have a visible focus. So the AACs applied reflect this. AAC 1, keyboard access, ensuring the dialogue is keyboard focusable. Because the dialogue needs to have the ability to be closed from the keyboard. AAC 4, visible focus. Any keyboard focus effect within the dialogue is, of course, visible. And AAC 7, screen reader. The dialogue is announced by the screen reader and uses the correct ARIA authoring patterns. All these cover the basic behavior this new feature requires. Using the AACs means they don't reduce the accessibility analysts' support, but they make the support targeted and is a way of identifying early enough where the developer's efforts with accessibility should be focused. Once a feature is built, there was still the expectation for teams to reach out and for us to perform spot audit checks of the feature prior to release to production. None of that goes away. It all continues. But I personally like absolute outcomes. I like the familiar way of documenting requirements for new features in such a detailed way that when the story is handed over to a developer, there is no ambiguity. They build from a complete blueprint. It gave me a sense of security, knowing that I've done all I need to do. But this approach doesn't encourage teams to self-serve. And it doesn't encourage teams to learn and understand accessibility. It encourages a copy and paste approach. If they're copying and pasting technical requirements, the developers aren't understanding the how, the whys, or the nuances. This approach ultimately becomes less effective. In large organizations with many teams all working simultaneously, you can't realistically provide that level of support. You must accept levels of overlapping support are what's needed. So combine these AACs with developer training, checklists, resources, and the ongoing support of accessibility analysts. Sometimes the perfect accessibility outcome is imperfect, and that's okay. Accessibility teams tend to be small, but this small footprint allows for innovative and nimble practices and scale-up support in ways which are pragmatic. And this is what accessibility acceptance criteria are. They're pragmatic. They bridge the gap with providing just enough guidance where user stories can be created without becoming bogged down in what perfect accessibility practice looks like. But they're not for everyone. You may already be in a small team working well with BAs and developers, and in that case, keep doing what you are doing. But if you begin finding the documenting of requirements is slowing down and impacting the delivery of features, then accessibility acceptance criteria may be another approach which might help you. We found that over time, as teams became familiar with the AACs, testers began having difficulty understanding what is actually being attested, and there was a sense of inaccurate understanding developing with what each accessibility acceptance criterion meant. So we created a companion document, the testing with the AACs, as a guide to give the testers a consistent approach to interpreting and understanding if the AACs have been applied correctly, using language testers are familiar with. And this in turn led us to thinking about other companion documents, including developing with the AACs. Being BA-centered meant us looking at things other than code, yet recognizing there was still a need for testers and developers to have their own documentation. But how did it turn out for us? Overall, the accessibility acceptance criteria worked well. They enable teams to self-serve their accessibility requirements on their own without our support, which on the face of it sounds pretty good. Over time, however, we noticed a few unusual trends between the teams. some business analysts were very confident applying the AACs and would to tag us in messages to confirm everything had been identified. And that showed us that they were thinking about the feature and how requirements could be applied to that feature. Yet other teams adopted a cut and paste approach of pasting all criteria into each feature and asking us to confirm it's the correct, but really wanting us to trim the story down to include only those criteria relevant. Looking at it pragmatically, has it made a difference? And of course, that's difficult to determine. Sure, with regular audits, the incidence of low-hanging accessibility errors reduced, but was this down to the AACs? Ultimately, it's the developers producing the code that is either accessible or not. Being past a user story with accessibility acceptance criteria called out is helpful. But if you're using a design system with a regular suite of components, over time, the accessibility will become better. Issues identified are fixed, pushed out, and then all teams consume. Really, the AACs are helping with the approach of building awareness of accessibility, but it's difficult to determine if shifting left and including more criteria at earlier stages in the build process is helping or just being performative. When you're so focused on the correct code, you only see code-based solutions, and blueprinting accessibility requirements comprehensively and intimately becomes the go-to for every occasion. Now, I'm not saying that isn't needed, and there certainly is a place for documenting that level of detail somewhere, and that place is often in smaller, more agile teams. But I also don't believe the effort should rest on the shoulders of the BAs alone. Anything that significantly affects the delivery means accessibility becomes the blocker and is reduced in scope or ignored. Accessibility acceptance criteria aren't for everyone, but they may help you document the core accessibility behavior early enough that helps teams further up the production, the pipeline, to be aware of outcomes which need to be demonstrated. There are also several resources available which we've made. There is a GitHub repository which has the accessibility acceptance criteria, along with a testing with the accessibility acceptance criteria document. That's found at github.com/CANAXESS/accessibility-acceptance-criteria. Thanks for listening. I'm Ross. I'm the director of CANAXESS, a digital accessibility company based in Australia, but working globally. We work with lots of interesting teams around the world. And if you're interested in working together, reach out to us at hello@canaxess.com.au. That's CANAXESS. Thank you.
Ross, thank you very much for that, and thank you for sharing that approach. I happen to know some of the players involved in that, and I know it's some good teams that we're all working together to try and pull it together, and a lot of great work you were doing. David, I'm going to pass over to you. It doesn't look like we've had any questions come through, but I'm sure, David, you got maybe one or two up your sleeve there for Ross, because I'm positive there's something there to quiz Ross on.
Yeah, I should do my best. Yeah. No questions on the feed, but I was interested in how you settled on these statements when you're building boiling down the WCAG criteria like this, how do you ensure that everything is kind of adequately covered in a single statement? Or how do you decide what's the most important thing to pull out there? You know, say the form control examples. You know, there's a variety of success criteria feeding into that one statement. So how do you settle on the key thing there?
Interesting question. What we found was it began with just our initial thoughts, identify if this made sense, ask the other teammates, and just iteratively work on it. Or where we recognise the first approach most likely wouldn't be right, and mine or another team member's approach might be biased. So we accepted that they're fallible, do our best efforts, and then passed it around the team, that making sure that everyone else has their view and their opinion. And so we recognize that whilst they miss lots of important points, the actual intent of it is covered. So it's often that a delicate judging act of, have we understood it basically. And I know that we left massive holes and gaps where we were unable to cover absolutely everything, but we recognize that, does this sort of meet what the criterion says? So it was pretty much a bit of an inexact science. So someone would write it out. We would then have a review of it together and individually, and then based on that feedback, iterate it and iterate it again and again. And so we recognize it's got gaps in it, but the core intention was there, I guess.
A pragmatic solution, really. Yeah. And how does it make it difficult to measure whether you've fully addressed WCAG? So we come into the kind of testing side of it. You know, how do you make sure WCAG is covered?
That's the hard thing, because there's endless resources out there regards checklists and everything else. A developer has so much knowledge there, but often there's lost in the forest, and we recognize that we can offer less and possibly help more. So recognize that, yes, we willingly accepted it's not covering everything, but is it covering at least half of that criterion? Often it did, but it left a lot of stuff there. So it was that a difficulty of accepting, is it good enough? Yes, it was, but we also recognize, whilst we could add more and more criteria, then it's becoming more and more detailed, and it's that balancing act of, we lacked detail, but we were able to move the development on more. But whether it helped out or not, I'm not sure. It looks promising, but at the end of the day, we're still offering that guided help. There's regular catch-ups. We're meeting regularly with a development team. So even if something's missed, we are addressing it early enough. So whether it helps or not sure.
David, I might jump in there, because I mean, two observations I've got. As I mentioned, I actually know who the customer in question here is, but I like the idea that it's bringing it earlier into the piece from a discussion perspective, which helps building that awareness, which Ross, you touched on, which I think is a fantastic thing. But I think, Ross, just to reiterate something you were touching on, this is one of multiple efforts happening in the organization to try to build and focus on accessibility. And that's why I can see where you're coming from, Ross, about the difficulty of going, does this particular piece, how do you judge its success when it's actually just one piece of a full suite of efforts happening across that organization to help ensure the improvements of accessibility across their product ranges? And maybe, yeah, Ross, if it was in a different organization, it was the only thing being focused on, might be more measurable, but I think it's still one of those scenarios of so much happening and the improvements are happening at the end at 3L, the output. But yeah, it's that collective effort of which this is just one of those added pieces that is just helping just nudge that along even better from an organization perspective. So yeah, I think that's an amazing thing we just need to keep in mind, is that you touched on it earlier, Ross, there's no silver bullet when it comes to accessibility. The more points we interact with across teams, the better outcome we're going to see come out of all of this.
Exactly right. And I guess it's that that point you mentioned. It's hard measuring something which is not hand wavy, but it might be at the other end of vagueness, where it helps, but how much of it is actually down to that rather than just an overall awareness piece. So yeah, that thing often sat a difficulty with me because I recognize, well, it's helping, but I can't really measure it. And if you can't measure it, you can't necessarily understand its impact either.
We've had some comments and some questions rolling in now. We've got a question from Ricky Onsman, who says, good talk, Ross. Do I understand correctly that you wouldn't raise, e.g., a keyboard trap unless it came up in a user story?
Oh, that's a interesting one, because it's recognizing that there's a core behavior there which needs to be addressed. But if you don't include it, I would imagine a developer wouldn't think, oh, I don't need that now because it's not there. So it's just reinforcing what's needed. But if it was absent, it would still be included. So in that instance, I would imagine if things are missed out, which are still needed, then they would be built in, because we would be meeting regularly still and catching it at a design or a development phase. So even though it might be missed out, we would still encounter it at another point and say, hey, you would need to do X, Y, and Z to include this.
Okay. We've got several. Beast Hilarious says, super interesting. Thank you. How have you handled teams adding accessibility acceptance criteria to their existing roadmap?
Difficult, that. So what we found is it's a real mixed bag. Some teams are confidently apply it where others don't. But if there is an existing roadmap, they have often budgeted that a time already, and so it's retroactively adding it, which I'm not sure if there's any relevancy there, because the features are being addressed already, and so just adding it into what's already being built serves little a purpose. So it's been helpful where it's been added retroactively and into existing roadmaps, but it's been that a challenge of recognizing it's helping, but whether it's helping a lot or a little, I'm not sure.
Makes sense. Okay. So yeah, I think that's about all we've got. Just on the question of resources, I think you had a slide on resources, didn't you? So people can access that if they need to. Yeah, great stuff. That's in there. Okay, Stuart, anything else to add?
Nothing else for myself, I think, other than just, reinforcing. I think all these little efforts definitely help in large organizations. So yeah, no, Ross, I think that's great. And I think Ross, I know you're maybe a little bit frustrated about how do you measure it. I don't think that's where the frustration should be yet. I think just starting with something like this is a good starting point. And I think that's where working with it, and as you keep working with it and others work with it, those measurements may come through. Like there's ways that potentially can do this, but you got to start somewhere. And I think, you've got a good starting point here, and it's now building off of that and working out, how can we start to figure out those measurement points to see its impact. Well, on that note, we will wrap this up. So, Ross, thank you very much for your time. And for everybody else, if you liked this session, hit that YouTube like button. And don't forget, you can subscribe to youtube.com/inclusive design 24 to be kept in the loop on our future events. Inclusive Design 24 is brought to you with thanks to our supporters: Barrier Break, Intopia, InfoAxia, Tetralogical, Intuit, Adrian Roselli LLC, Assistive Labs, the Law Office of Laney Feingold, Skyscanner, and Bispero. Inclusive Design 24 will be back on the hour with our next session. See you then.